When her husband said, "I'm moving back in with my ex-wife to take care of her," she smiled, packed his bags, and drove him to her. What she slipped into her mailbox brought him back home empty-handed in less than 48 hours. "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome to Mr. Peter's Stories. May the Almighty surround you with endless mercy, bless your homes with peace that cannot be broken, and fill your hearts with strength that never fades. May every woman walk with honor unshaken, every man be guided with wisdom that inspires, and every child laugh with joy that lights the world. May no sickness touch you, no sorrow weigh you down, and may your days shine brighter than the stars above. I pray for your health, your success, and your family's happiness, that every step leads to blessings and every night brings you rest. May God lift you when you fall, guide you when you doubt, and hold you forever close in His love. But my family, with love I ask, why do some of you stay silent without liking or commenting? Every like, every word is the heartbeat that keeps this family alive. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, "I am with Mr. Peter." Some women scream when their world shatters. Some throw plates and curse the heavens. Some fall to their knees and beg for explanations that will never satisfy. Melissa Swift did none of these things. When her husband destroyed their marriage with a single sentence, she smiled like a queen watching her kingdom burn, then calmly packed his bags with hands that didn't shake once. The house had been silent all evening. Alex Hopkins sat in his favorite leather chair, the one Melissa had surprised him with after he'd mentioned wanting something comfortable to read in. That chair faced the window overlooking their garden, where roses bloomed in colors she'd chosen because they reminded her of sunset. She'd planted each one herself, spending weekends on her knees in the dirt, creating something beautiful for them to enjoy together. Their marriage had been the kind other people whispered about with envy. Candlelit dinners that stretched past midnight, where they'd talk about everything and nothing, where laughter came as easily as breathing. Late nights when they'd lie on the balcony under stars, wrapped in blankets, making promises about growing old together. She'd trace patterns on his chest, and he'd play with her hair, and the world outside their bubble simply didn't exist. He called her his queen. She called him her heart. People at parties would watch them and wonder what their secret was, how they made love look so effortless. Friends would pull Melissa aside and ask her advice, wanting to know how she kept the spark alive, how she made marriage look like an adventure instead of an obligation. She'd smile and say there was no secret, just choosing each other every day. Melissa had given him everything, not just her love, but her intelligence, her strength, her unwavering faith in who he could become. When he doubted himself, she reminded him of his power. When he stumbled, she steadied him without making him feel weak. She was the foundation he built his confidence on, though he'd long stopped acknowledging the ground beneath his feet. She'd sacrificed opportunities, turned down invitations, rearranged her entire world to orbit around his needs, his comfort, his dreams. That evening, she'd made his favorite meal. The dining room table was set with care, candles flickering between them, casting shadows that danced on the walls. She'd spent the afternoon cooking, humming to herself, unaware that this would be their last dinner as husband and wife. The playlist she'd created for their wedding anniversary played softly in the background, songs that marked moments in their relationship, melodies that had soundtracked their love story. Alex barely touched his food. He pushed the perfectly seasoned vegetables around his plate, his fork scraping porcelain in a rhythm that set her teeth on edge. She watched him, recognizing the distance in his eyes, the way he couldn't quite meet her gaze. She'd seen this look before, in the mirror, on other women's faces, when they knew something was coming, but couldn't yet name it. "You're not eating," she said softly, her voice carrying none of the anxiety building in her chest. He set down his fork with deliberate care. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet room. The music had ended, leaving only silence and the soft crackle of candle flames. "Melissa, we need to talk. 4 words. 4 simple words that women everywhere have learned to fear because they never precede anything good. She placed her own fork down, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. Her heart was pounding, but her face remained perfectly calm. She had learned early in life that showing pain only invited more of it. Alex stood, walked to the window, his back to her. He couldn't face her for what came next. Cowards rarely can. He stared at the garden she'd created, at the roses she'd planted for them, and prepared to walk away from it all. "I'm moving back in with Anita." The room seemed to tilt. Melissa's fingers gripped the edge of the table, but her face remained perfectly calm. She had learned early in life that showing pain only invited more of it. The candles continued flickering. The silence stretched. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, normal life continuing while hers ended. "Your ex-wife," she said, her voice steady as stone. "She needs me." He turned slightly, still not fully facing her. "She's going through a difficult time, and I can't just abandon her when she needs help. She reached out and she's struggling, and I'm the only one who can help her through this." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Melissa could have laughed at the absurdity. This was the same Anita who had destroyed him before, the same woman who had betrayed him with another man, who had left him shattered and hollow, the same ex-wife whose name he'd sworn never to speak again, whose memory he claimed to have erased from his heart, the same woman who'd called him weak when she left, who'd told him he wasn't man enough for her, who'd broken every promise they'd made, and now she needed him. And that was apparently enough to erase everything. To erase Melissa, to erase their vows, to erase devotion and loyalty and love. When? Melissa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight." His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm leaving tonight. I've already told her I'm coming. She's waiting for me." The finality of it hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't a discussion. This wasn't a conversation where he wanted her input or her perspective. This was an announcement, a decision already made. She was being informed, not consulted. She could have screamed, could have thrown her plate at his head, could have begged him to reconsider, to remember who they were, to choose her over a ghost from his past. She could have cried, pleaded, demanded he explain how he could throw away everything they'd built. She could have listed everything she'd sacrificed, every dream she'd deferred, every piece of herself she'd given to make him happy. But Melissa Swift was not a woman who begged. Instead, something shifted in her eyes, something ancient and powerful, something that had been sleeping through devotion and now woke up sharp as a blade. A clarity descended over her, cold and precise. If he wanted to leave, she would make it easy. She would make it so easy that he'd have nothing to blame but himself when it all fell apart. She stood from the table with such grace, it looked choreographed. "I'll help you pack." Alex blinked, confusion crossing his face. "What?" "I said I'll help you pack your things." She walked past him toward their bedroom, her footsteps measured and calm. "You'll want your good shirts, and your cologne, the one Anita always liked, the one she bought you before I knew you existed." He followed her, watching as she opened his closet with steady hands. She pulled shirts from hangers, folded them with the same care she always had, creased the sleeves perfectly, stacked them neatly in his suitcase. Each movement was precise, controlled, elegant. She'd packed this suitcase for him countless times before, for trips, for conferences, for visits to family. But this time was different. This time she was packing him out of her life. "Melissa, he started, but she cut him off. "Your grey pants. You'll need those. And these shoes. They're comfortable for driving. You'll be doing a lot of driving back and forth, I imagine. Visiting her, taking care of her, being the hero she needs." The barb landed, but her tone remained sweet, conversational. She moved through their bedroom like a dancer performing a routine she'd practiced. Socks rolled and tucked into corners, ties coiled without wrinkles. His watch, his cufflinks, his leather belt that she'd bought him for his birthday after noticing his old one was worn. Alex stood frozen, watching his wife dismantle their marriage with perfect posture and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. He'd expected tears. He'd prepared speeches for her breakdown. He'd braced himself for her pain. had even prepared himself to comfort her through the devastation he was causing. He'd imagined holding her while she cried, explaining gently why he had to do this, making her understand. He got none of it. And somehow, that was more terrifying than any tantrum could have been. "Do you want your blue sweater?" she asked, her voice conversational, as if they were discussing weekend plans. "It might be cold where you're going. Anita always kept her house cold, didn't she? I remember you mentioning that. You'll need layers. Melissa, please." "Please what, Alex?" She turned to face him fully, and for just a moment he saw something flash in her eyes. Not pain, not even anger. Something colder and far more dangerous. Something that looked like power, like knowledge, like a trap snapping shut. "Please make this harder for you. Please cry and beg you to stay? Is that what you need to feel better about what you're doing? Do you need me to fall apart so you can feel like the decision was difficult?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no answer that wouldn't make him sound like exactly what he was. A coward, a fool, a man choosing ego over love. She zipped his suitcase with finality. The sound was like a punctuation mark, ending a sentence, closing a chapter. "I'll drive you. You don't have to." "I said I'll drive you." Her tone left no room for argument. "It's late. You're emotional. You shouldn't drive when you're emotional, Alex. You might make another terrible decision. Though I suppose that would be quite the achievement, making a worse decision than the one you're making right now." The barb landed, but she delivered it with such sweetness he almost missed it. Her smile was serene, her movements graceful, her control absolute. She carried his suitcase down the stairs herself, refusing his offer to help. She loaded it into the trunk of her car, with strength he'd forgotten she possessed, strength she'd developed carrying the weight of their relationship alone. Then she slid into the driver's seat and waited while he fumbled with his seatbelt like a child. The drive was suffocatingly silent. Alex stared out the window, watching streetlights pass in blurred succession, familiar streets taking on an unfamiliar quality in the darkness. He tried several times to speak, to explain, to justify, but every time he looked at Melissa's profile, so calm, so serene, so utterly in control, the words died in his throat. Her jaw was set, her eyes focused on the road, her hands steady on the wheel. She knew the way to Anita's house. Of course she did. She'd driven past it before, when Anita had first started reaching out to Alex with her sob stories and her careful manipulations. Melissa had said nothing then. She'd watched quietly, waiting to see if her husband would be stupid enough to fall for it. She'd given him the chance to be better than his worst instincts. He wasn't. He'd failed every test without even knowing he was being tested. When they pulled into Anita's driveway, Melissa put the car in park but didn't turn off the engine. She sat there for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at the house that would become Alex's new home. A house with peeling paint and overgrown hedges. Nothing like the home they'd built together. "Melissa," Alex said, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything, but I am. I have to do this. I have to help her. She has no one else. I can't just abandon someone who needs me. No, Alex, you want to do this." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were oceans deep, filled with knowledge he couldn't fathom. "There's a difference between have to and want to. You want to feel needed. You want to play hero. You want to believe that you're the only one who can save her, because it makes you feel important. It makes you feel like you matter in a way that my steady, quiet love apparently doesn't." He flinched like she'd slapped him. The truth of her words cut deeper than anger ever could. "But that's fine," she continued, her voice soft and deadly. "You should go. You should absolutely go in there and be her savior. You should give her everything she asks for, everything she needs, everything she pretends to need. You should exhaust yourself trying to fill a hole that has no bottom. You should learn the difference between being needed and being used." She reached across him and opened his door. The interior light came on, harsh and exposing. "Because when you're done, when she's finished with you, when you've given everything and realized it was never going to be enough, you'll understand what you had with me. You'll understand what you threw away. You'll understand the difference between someone who needs you and someone who loves you." Alex climbed out of the car like a man walking to his own execution. He retrieved his suitcase from the trunk, and when he closed it, Melissa was standing beside him. She'd gotten out without him noticing, silent as smoke, graceful as always. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. For a moment, he thought it was a letter for him, some final goodbye or declaration. But she walked past him to the mailbox at the edge of Anita's property and slipped the envelope inside, her movements deliberate and final. "What's that?" he asked, though some part of him didn't want to know. She turned back to him, and her smile could have cut diamonds. "Insurance." Before he could ask what she meant, she was back in the car. The window rolled down, and she looked at him one last time. Her eyes held something he couldn't quite read. Not sadness, not anger, but something else. Something that looked almost like pity. "Goodbye, Alex. I hope she's everything you remember. I hope she gives you everything you think you need. I hope you find exactly what you're looking for." Then she drove away, taillights disappearing into the darkness, leaving him standing in a driveway that didn't belong to him, holding a suitcase full of clothes that would never feel like home again, watching the only woman who'd ever truly loved him disappear from his life. The front door opened. Anita stood there in the glow of the porch light, her smile wide and painted, her arms spread in welcome. She wore a dress that was too tight, makeup that was too heavy, perfume that was too strong. Everything about her was too much, too performed, too calculated. "Darling," she called out, her voice dripping with honey and lies. "I've missed you so much. Come inside, come home. Come be the man I need you to be." Alex picked up his suitcase and walked toward her, toward the woman he thought he wanted, away from the woman he'd just destroyed. Each step felt heavier than the last, like he was walking through water, like some part of him knew this was wrong, but his pride pushed him forward anyway. He didn't look back. If he had, he might have seen Melissa's car stopped at the corner, might have seen her hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles had gone white, might have seen the single tear that finally escaped and traced down her cheek before she wiped it away with angry precision, and drove into the night. But he didn't look back. Men like Alex never do. They're too busy walking toward their own destruction to notice the devastation they leave behind. Chapter 2. The Planted. Truth. Melissa drove for hours with no destination in mind. Her hands remained steady on the wheel, her eyes fixed on roads that blurred together in the darkness. She didn't cry, not yet. Crying was for later, for when she was alone in a house that would echo with absence, for when she didn't need to be strong anymore. The envelope she'd placed in Anita's mailbox sat heavy in her thoughts. She'd prepared it carefully, methodically, when she first suspected where Alex's heart was drifting. While he thought she was oblivious, living in blissful ignorance of his growing distance, she'd been gathering evidence, documenting truths, collecting the secrets he thought were buried deep enough to stay hidden. Inside that envelope were financial records showing debts he'd never mentioned, proof of poor decisions he'd made and covered up, documentation of promises he'd broken to others, lies he'd told to cover his tracks. Not to her, she already knew his flaws intimately, had studied them the way a scholar studies ancient texts, but to people who mattered in his world, people who respected him, people whose opinions he valued. She'd included a handwritten note, addressed to Anita in elegant script that had taken her 3 attempts to perfect. "Since you want him so badly, you should know exactly what you're getting. Consider this a gift from one woman to another. Use it wisely. He's all yours now. Flaws, debts, secrets and all." The documents would give Anita power over Alex. Complete, undeniable power. And Anita, being exactly who Melissa knew she was, a manipulator, a user, a woman who saw people as tools, wouldn't be able to resist using that power. She'd control him, manipulate him, show him what it felt like to be trapped. She'd squeeze him dry and discard him, just as she'd done before. Melissa had handed Anita the weapons. Now she'd watch from a distance as Alex learned what it meant to be with someone who didn't love you. She pulled into an empty parking lot overlooking the city lights, a place she and Alex had come to early in their relationship, when everything was new and possible. They'd sat in this very spot, talking about their future, making plans, believing love was enough. She'd been so naive then, so trusting. She turned off the engine and sat in the silence, letting the weight of the day finally settle on her shoulders like a physical thing, pressing down, making it hard to breathe. She'd loved him. God, she'd loved him so completely, so thoroughly, so without reservation. She'd shaped her life around his needs, his dreams, his ambitions. She'd been the strength behind his confidence, the wisdom behind his decisions, the grace behind his success. She'd made herself smaller so he could feel bigger. She'd dimmed her own light so his could shine brighter. And he'd never even noticed. Or worse, he'd noticed and taken it for granted, assumed it was his due, believed he deserved her devotion without earning it. Her phone buzzed. A message from her sister. "Are you okay? Call me when you can. I'm worried about you." Melissa stared at the message. Her sister had warned her, had seen what Melissa refused to see, had gently suggested that Alex took her for granted, that he didn't appreciate what he had. Melissa had defended him, made excuses, insisted their love was strong enough to weather anything. She'd been wrong. She didn't call back. She wasn't ready to speak the words out loud yet, wasn't ready to make it real by telling someone else what had happened. Saying my husband left me for his ex-wife would make it true in a way it wasn't yet, would make it permanent. Instead, she started the car and drove home. Not to the house she'd shared with Alex. That place was contaminated now with the memory of his leaving, with the ghost of what they'd been, but to her childhood home, where her mother lived alone, where Melissa had always found refuge in difficult times. The lights were on despite the late hour. Her mother must have sensed something, the way mothers do, that invisible connection that transcends distance and time. She was waiting in the doorway when Melissa pulled up, her face etched with concern, her arms already opening before Melissa even got out of the car. One look at Melissa's face told her mother everything she needed to know. Arms opened, and Melissa finally let herself collapse into them, let the tears come, let herself be broken just for a moment before she'd have to become unbreakable again. She sobbed into her mother's shoulder. Years of trying to be perfect, trying to be enough, trying to hold together a marriage that one person couldn't sustain alone. All pouring out. "He left," Melissa whispered into her mother's shoulder between sobs. "He chose her. After everything. After all I gave him. He chose her." "Then he's a fool," her mother said, holding her daughter tight, stroking her hair the way she had when Melissa was small and the world hurt too much. "And fools always pay for their foolishness, always. The universe has a way of teaching hard lessons to those who need them most." "I wasn't enough," Melissa choked out. "I tried so hard to be enough, and I still wasn't." "No, baby." Her mother pulled back, gripping Melissa's shoulders, forcing eye contact. "You were more than enough. You were everything. He just wasn't smart enough to see it. That's his failure, not yours. Don't you dare make his blindness about your worth." They moved inside, to the kitchen, where Melissa had spent countless hours as a child, where her mother made tea with hands that knew the routine by heart. They sat at the old wooden table, and Melissa told her everything: Anita's sudden reappearance, Alex's growing distance, the envelope she'd left, her plan to let him destroy himself. Her mother listened without judgment, without interruption, the way only a mother can. When Melissa finished, her mother reached across the table and took her hand. "You're stronger than you know," she said. "You're going to survive this. And when he comes crawling back, and he will, they always do, you'll be ready. You'll know exactly who you are without him, and that knowledge will be your power." Meanwhile, across town, Alex stood in Anita's guest room, unpacking his suitcase with growing unease. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too cold. The walls were bare, where his and Melissa's house had been filled with photos and art and memories. The air smelled stale, unlived-in, temporary, nothing like the home he'd left. Anita had been welcoming enough, all smiles and soft words. She'd shown him to his room. "You'll sleep here until we figure things out," she'd said. And he'd tried not to notice the distance in that statement, the lack of invitation to her bed, the careful boundary she'd drawn, and left him alone to settle in. The room was sparse. A bed with generic bedding, a nightstand with nothing on it, a lamp that flickered when he turned it on, a window that overlooked a backyard full of dead grass and broken fence posts. Everything felt temporary, like a hotel room, like a place you stayed but never lived. He sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, his phone in his hands, Melissa's number on the screen. His thumb hovered over the call button. What would he even say? "I made a mistake" felt too small for what he'd done. "Come get me" made him pathetic. "I love you" was true but meaningless after what he'd done. Hollow words after devastating action. He didn't call. Instead, he lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, at water stains that formed patterns like maps to nowhere. He wondered why the victory of returning to Anita felt so much like defeat. Why getting what he thought he wanted left him feeling empty and hollow. Downstairs, he heard movement. Anita retrieving her mail, sorting through bills and junk and advertisements. Then silence. Then footsteps moving quickly, purposefully, towards somewhere else in the house. She'd found the envelope. Anita stood in her kitchen, her hands shaking slightly as she read the contents. Melissa's note. Then the documents, proof of Alex's hidden debts, his financial missteps, his careful deceptions, details of money borrowed and not repaid, evidence of promises broken to people who'd trusted him, records of decisions he'd hidden from everyone, including his wife. A slow smile spread across Anita's face as she read. This was better than she'd hoped. This was perfect. She'd wanted Alex back for practical reasons, not romantic ones. She needed his help, needed his resources, needed someone to blame when things went wrong, needed someone to take care of her problems while she focused on what mattered to her. But this documentation, these secrets, this leverage, gave her complete control. She could keep him exactly where she wanted him, doing exactly what she needed, with no chance of escape. She pulled out her phone and called Jamie Smith. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep, annoyed at being woken. "It's done," she said softly, excitement thrumming under her words. "He's here, and it's going to be even easier than we thought." "The wife made trouble?" Jamie asked, more awake now, interested. "The wife," Anita said, looking at Melissa's note with something almost like respect, reading it again, appreciating its cold precision. "Gave us a gift. She handed me everything I need to keep him in line. Every secret, every mistake, every piece of leverage we could possibly want. Smart woman." "Smart enough to know exactly what I am," Anita agreed, her voice carrying grudging admiration. "And smart enough to let me destroy him for her. She's handing him over gift-wrapped with instructions on where to hurt him most." She hung up and tucked the documents into her safe, handling them carefully like the precious weapons they were. Then she climbed the stairs to check on her new house guest, preparing her face into the expression of vulnerable need that worked so well on men like Alex. She found him still dressed, still lying on top of the covers, staring at the ceiling like it held answers. His expression was lost, uncertain, already beginning to doubt. "Perfect. Can't sleep?" she asked from the doorway, her voice sugary sweet, concern dripping from every word. "Just thinking." "About her?" She let hurt creep into her voice, let him hear the pain of being second choice, of not being enough. It was all performance, but he wouldn't know that. Alex didn't answer. He didn't need to. The guilt on his face said everything. Anita walked into the room and sat on the edge of the bed, placing a carefully manicured hand on his arm. Her touch was cold despite the warm room. "She'll be fine, Alex. Women like her always are. They're survivors. She'll move on. She probably already has someone waiting in the wings." The suggestion landed like she'd intended. She saw him flinch, saw the jealousy and insecurity flare in his eyes. "I know," he said quietly, though he didn't know anything. "That's what worries me." Anita's smile was hidden in the darkness. Don't worry about her. Worry about us. Worry about rebuilding what we lost. Worry about being the man I need you to be. You are going to be that man, aren't you? You're not going to disappoint me again? There was something in her tone, something he couldn't quite identify. It sounded almost like a threat wrapped in velvet, like love with teeth, like sweetness with poison underneath. I'll be whatever you need, he said. Because that's what men say when they're trying to convince themselves they made the right choice. When they're trying to believe the lie they've told themselves. I know you will, Anita replied, patting his arm like he was a good dog. Now get some rest. Tomorrow we have a lot to discuss. So much to plan. So much you're going to help me with. She left him alone again. As her footsteps faded down the hallway, Alex closed his eyes and tried to remember why he'd wanted this so badly. Tried to remember what about Anita had pulled him away from Melissa. Tried to recall the feeling that had made abandoning his marriage seem reasonable. All he could see was Melissa's face as she'd driven away. The calm in her eyes, the absolute control in her posture, the smile that said she knew something he didn't, that said she'd already seen how this would end, that envelope she'd placed in the mailbox. Insurance, she'd called it. Insurance against what? What had she given Anita? What power had she handed over? Sleep didn't come easily. When it finally did, his dreams were haunted by two women, one who'd loved him completely, and one who'd never loved him at all. By morning, those truths would become impossible to ignore. The trap was set, the cage was closing, and Alex Hopkins had walked into it willingly, smiling, thinking he was choosing freedom when he was really choosing chains. Chapter 3. The Manipulation. Begins. Alex woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of voices drifting up from downstairs. For a disoriented moment, he expected to see Melissa beside him, expected their bedroom with its familiar walls and her collection of books on the nightstand, expected the soft morning light filtering through curtains she'd chosen. Instead, he found himself in a sparse guest room with generic furniture and curtains that didn't quite block out the harsh morning sun. Reality crashed back like cold water. He'd left. He was at Anita's house. He'd chosen this. He'd walked away from everything for this strange, uncomfortable room in a house that didn't feel like home. The voices downstairs grew clearer as sleep faded. Anita's laugh, high and performative, followed by a deeper male voice he didn't recognize. Alex dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes. He hadn't thought to bring enough, hadn't planned beyond the romantic notion of reunion, and made his way down. Following the sound to the kitchen, Anita stood at the counter in a silk robe that probably cost more than it should, pouring coffee into expensive cups that didn't match the run-down state of the rest of the house. Across from her sat a man Alex's age, maybe slightly younger, dressed in clothes that screamed casual wealth. Designer labels worn carelessly, expensive watch glinting in the morning light. He had the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to prove himself, never having to work for anything. "Alex!" Anita's voice was bright. Too bright for someone who'd supposedly been struggling. Too cheerful for someone who supposedly needed saving. Perfect timing. "I want you to meet someone important." The man stood, extending his hand with a smile that showed too many teeth. "Jamie Smith, great to finally meet you. Anita's told me so much about you. All good things, I promise." His grip was firm. His smile was predatory. Alex disliked him immediately, though he couldn't articulate why. Something about the way Jamie looked at Anita, the familiarity in his posture, the comfort in his presence here. "Jamie is my—" Anita paused, as if searching for the right word. "Very close friend. He's been helping me through some difficult situations." "Close friend," Alex repeated the words, tasting something bitter that had nothing to do with the coffee Anita handed him. "That's right." Jamie settled back into his chair, completely comfortable in Anita's kitchen, in her space, in her life. His hand rested on the table where Anita's had been moments before, occupying the same space with the same ownership. Anita and I have known each other for quite a while now. I've been trying to help her navigate some challenging circumstances." Anita's expression shifted, vulnerability replacing the brightness like an actress changing masks. It looked rehearsed, like she'd practiced the transition in a mirror, perfecting the exact amount of tears to let well up without actually falling. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about, Alex. Why I reached out. Why I told you I needed you." She sat down at the table, gesturing for Alex to join them. He did, though everything in his gut told him to run, told him this wasn't right, told him he'd made a terrible mistake. But pride kept him in his chair. He'd left Melissa for this. He couldn't admit doubt now. "I'm in trouble," Anita said softly, her eyes meeting his with calculated sincerity, with practiced vulnerability. "Real trouble. I made some poor decisions with people I thought I could trust. He got involved in situations that seemed fine at first, but turned complicated. And now I'm facing consequences I can't handle alone." Jamie nodded gravely, playing his part perfectly. "We've tried every option we can think of, every avenue, but the problems keep getting worse. Anita's been barely sleeping, barely eating. She's terrified." "I'm sorry to hear that," Alex said carefully, his protective instincts warring with his suspicions. "But I'm not sure what this has to do with me. How can I help?" Anita reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her skin was cold despite the warm kitchen, despite the coffee, despite everything. "You've always been brilliant at solving impossible problems. You see solutions where other people see dead ends. You make sense of chaos. You're strategic, thoughtful, capable. I know it's asking a lot. I know I have no right to ask anything after how I treated you, but I was hoping you might look at my situation. Give me advice. Help me figure out if there's any way to fix what I've broken." The flattery was laid on thick, each word chosen specifically to appeal to his ego, to make him feel essential. But it worked. Alex felt his chest expand slightly, felt the old familiar sensation of being needed, of being the smartest person in the room, of being irreplaceable. "I could take a look," he heard himself saying, even as part of him screamed not to. "No promises, but I could review your situation and see if there's anything I can suggest." Jamie's smile widened, triumphant. "That would be incredible. Really, man, we'd be so grateful. Anita's been saying you were the only one who could help, and I'm starting to see why." They spent the next several hours at the dining room table, papers spread everywhere. Jamie and Anita explaining their complicated web of debts and obligations. The details were vague, the specifics deliberately fuzzy, but the picture they painted was of two people in over their heads, drowning in problems not entirely of their making. Alex listened, asked questions, began to see patterns. It was bad, they said, really bad, but maybe not unfixable. Maybe not if someone smart was willing to take certain risks, willing to help in specific ways, willing to put their own reputation and resources on the line. By afternoon, his mind was churning with possibilities. This was familiar territory, the kind of challenge that had always energized him. Problem-solving, being essential, being the hero. He'd forgotten, in the midst of his comfortable marriage with Melissa, how good it felt to be desperately needed, rather than quietly appreciated. As Jamie gathered his papers, preparing to leave, Anita walked him to the door. Alex heard them speaking in low tones, caught fragments that made his stomach clench. "Knee, exactly as planned, and he's already hooked, and easier than we thought." He chose to ignore it, chose to believe he'd misheard, chose to rationalize, because the alternative, that he destroyed his marriage for a manipulation, was too devastating to consider. That evening, after Jamie left, Anita made dinner. Nothing elaborate, just pasta and salad, but she served it with candles between them, with wine in crystal glasses that looked expensive but were probably cheap, with a softness in her expression that reminded Alex of who they'd been in the past. Before betrayal, before pain, before everything went wrong. "Thank you for today," she said, twirling pasta on her fork with practiced delicacy. "For listening, for caring enough to try to help, for being here when I have no right to ask for your help. Of course, I told you I'd be here for you. That's why I came. I know you did." She set down her fork, her gaze intense, holding him captive. Alex, I need to be honest with you about something. Something I should have told you a long time ago. His stomach tightened with apprehension. Okay. When we broke up, when I left you before, that was the biggest mistake of my life. Her voice wavered convincingly, tears gathering in her eyes like she'd rehearsed. I was young and stupid, and I thought I wanted excitement. I thought the grass was greener. I thought you weren't enough, that there was something better out there. But I was wrong, so wrong. Nothing was ever as good as what we had. Anita, let me finish, please. She reached for his hand again, her grip desperate, her eyes pleading. I've spent so long regretting what I did to you. Years wishing I could go back and make different choices. Years wondering what our life could have been if I hadn't been so foolish. And when things started falling apart for me, when everything was crashing down around me, all I could think was that I needed you. That you were the only person who'd ever really understood me. The only man who ever really saw me. The words should have sounded romantic. Instead, they sounded like a speech she'd memorized, lines delivered with just enough emotion to be convincing, but not enough to be real. But Alex wanted to believe them, needed to believe them. Because if Anita's words were lies, then he'd destroyed his marriage for nothing. He'd hurt Melissa for no reason. He'd thrown away love for manipulation. I'm here now, he said quietly, squeezing her hand. That's what matters. We can start over. Yes. Her smile was victorious, though she disguised it as relief, as gratitude, as love. You're here. And maybe if we can get through this crisis together, maybe we could have a second chance. Maybe we could be what we should have been the first time. What we were meant to be before I ruined everything. His heart beat faster with hope, with possibility, with the seductive lie that mistakes could be undone. You really mean that? I do. She stood, walking around the table to stand beside his chair, embodying everything he'd dreamed of during his marriage, when he'd let his mind wander to what-ifs and might-have-beens. Her fingers traced along his shoulder, his neck, familiar patterns from years ago, muscle memory from a relationship that had ended in betrayal but that he'd romanticized over time. But I need to know you're really here, Alex, really committed, not just to helping with my problems, but to us, to me. To building something real. He tilted his head back to look at her, desperate to believe, desperate to feel essential. How do I prove that? She bent down, her lips close to his ear, her breath warm against his skin. Help me. Show me that I was right to believe in you. Show me that you're the man I always knew you could be. Do that? Her breath was deliberately warm against his skin, calculated seduction. And I'll be yours again, completely, the way it should have been all along, the way it would have been if I hadn't been so blind. Every alarm in his head should have been screaming. Every instinct should have told him this was manipulation, that he was being played like an instrument, that her words were carefully crafted to hook into his ego and vanity and desperate need to be needed. But his ego was louder than his instincts. His vanity was louder than his common sense. His need to feel essential drowned out the quiet voice of reason. I'll do it, he said, committing without knowing what he was committing to. I'll help you, whatever it takes, whatever you need. Her smile was hidden in his hair as she held him, her expression triumphant where he couldn't see it. I knew you would. You've always been my hero, even when I was too stupid to appreciate it. Upstairs, tucked in her safe, sat Melissa's envelope. The insurance policy that would keep Alex in line if he tried to back out, if he started to see through the performance, if he began to question what was really happening here. But Anita didn't think she'd need it. Not yet. Men like Alex, with their pride and their need to be needed, with their hunger to feel essential and their desperate desire to prove their worth, were easier to control than they ever realized. They controlled themselves, really. You just had to point them in the right direction and let their own ego do the rest. She'd have everything she needed from him, and he'd give it willingly, thinking he was earning love that had never existed, thinking he was building something real when he was really just being used. That night, when Alex reached for her in the darkness, When his hands found her waist and his lips sought her neck with the familiarity of someone who'd been here before, Anita turned away, cold, absolute. "Not yet," she whispered, her voice carrying just enough regret to sound authentic. "When things are fixed, when you've proven yourself, when you've shown me I can trust you not to disappoint me again, then we'll have everything we've been waiting for. Then we'll have what we should have had all along." He lay awake beside her cold back, staring at the ceiling, wondering why achieving what he wanted felt so hollow, wondering why success felt like failure, wondering why being needed felt more like being used. Across town, in her mother's guest room, Melissa lay awake too. She knew exactly what was happening in Anita's house. She'd predicted every move, anticipated every manipulation, understood the game being played because she'd watched Anita play it before. Tomorrow she'd start putting her own life back together. Tomorrow she'd remember who she was before she became Alex's wife, before she made herself smaller to make him feel bigger. But tonight she let herself imagine the moment when Alex would finally understand, when the scales would fall from his eyes and he'd see Anita for exactly what she was, see himself for exactly what he'd become. It would hurt him, destroy him probably, break something in him that might never heal properly, and a small dark part of Melissa's heart whispered, "Good. Let him learn. Let him suffer. Let him understand what it means to give everything and receive nothing. Let him know how it feels to be used." The trap was closing, and Alex Hopkins was too blind to see the bars. Chapter 4. The Poisoned Paradise. The days blurred together in Anita's house, each one bleeding into the next with an uncomfortable familiarity that never quite became comfort. Alex threw himself into helping Anita, spending hours analyzing her problems, making calls to contacts who might help, mapping out potential solutions to situations that became more complex the deeper he dug. The more Alex investigated, the more questions emerged. Decisions that made no sense. Choices that seemed almost deliberately designed to create problems rather than solve them. Arrangements that benefited everyone except Anita. Deals that looked like they'd been structured to fail from the beginning. But whenever he raised concerns, whenever he pointed out inconsistencies or questioned the narrative she was feeding him, Anita had explanations ready. She'd trusted the wrong advisor, she said. She'd been pressured into bad decisions by people who took advantage of her vulnerability. She'd been naive, vulnerable, taken advantage of by people who saw her inexperience and exploited it without mercy. Her eyes would fill with tears as she explained, and Alex would feel guilty for doubting her, feel like he was kicking her when she was already down, feel like he was being the kind of man who didn't trust women when they asked for help, would feel like he was being cruel when she needed kindness. So he stopped asking difficult questions and focused on finding solutions instead, on being the hero she claimed to need. It was during this time that the small cruelties began. Subtle at first, so subtle that Alex almost missed them, so carefully calibrated that he couldn't quite identify them as attacks. "Are you wearing that shirt?" Anita asked one morning as he came down for coffee. Her tone was light, almost playful, but there was an edge beneath it, a judgment wrapped in concern. "What's wrong with my shirt?" "Nothing, I suppose. If you're not worried about looking your best, if you don't care about making a good impression, but you look—" She paused, as if searching for a kind word. "Sloppy, careless, like you've given up on yourself." Alex looked down at his shirt. It was one Melissa had picked out for him, had said brought out the color in his eyes, had told him he looked handsome in. He'd always felt confident wearing it, had received compliments on it at parties and gatherings. Now it felt wrong, shabby, inadequate. He went back upstairs and changed. When he came down in a different shirt, Anita smiled with approval. "Much better. You should trust my judgment on these things, Alex. I know what works. I know what makes a man look like he's worth paying attention to." Melissa clearly didn't teach you anything about style. The mention of Melissa felt like a slap, but Alex said nothing. He drank his coffee and pretended the criticism didn't sting. The next day, she commented on how he loaded the dishwasher. "That's not how it's done. Honestly, did no one ever teach you anything? Were you raised by wolves?" Then it was how he folded towels, how he parked the car, how he chewed his food, how he breathed too loudly at night. Each correction delivered with a laugh, as if she was joking, as if it was all in good fun, as if she was just trying to help him improve himself. But the criticisms accumulated like drops of poison, each one small enough to dismiss alone, but together forming a toxin that seeped into his confidence. Each comment chipped away at the foundation of his self-worth, leaving him constantly second-guessing, constantly inadequate, constantly failing tests he didn't know he was taking. Jamie's presence became more frequent, more intrusive, more obviously territorial. He'd show up for breakfast, stay through lunch, linger into the evening. He had keys to the house, Alex noticed. Multiple keys, walked through rooms like he owned them, opened the refrigerator without asking, sprawled on the couch like it was his furniture, touched Anita's shoulder in passing with a familiarity that made Alex's jaw tighten, his hands clench, his stomach turn with jealousy he had no right to feel but couldn't suppress. Jamie is just affectionate with everyone, Anita explained when Alex finally gathered the courage to mention it. When the touching became too much to ignore. It's how some people are. Physical touch is his love language. You wouldn't understand. You're too uptight, too rigid, too controlled. The criticism embedded in the explanation wasn't lost on Alex. He was too uptight, too rigid, too controlled. Another flaw added to the growing list. The comparisons started innocuously enough, small observations that built into a relentless pattern. Jamie fixed the leaking faucet upstairs. Took him hardly any time at all. He's so capable, so handy, so useful to have around. Not like some people who need to call professionals for everything. Jamie suggested this wine. He knows everything about vintages. He's so cultured, so sophisticated. He's traveled everywhere, experienced everything. Isn't it delicious? Don't you wish you knew about these things? Jamie thinks I should handle things differently. He's so innovative in his thinking, so creative, so much smarter about these situations than most people, Jamie thinks. Jamie knows. Jamie does. Jamie succeeds where others fail. Each mention of Jamie's name felt like a paper cut, small but stinging, accumulating into 1,000 tiny wounds that bled Alex's confidence away drop by drop. Then came the nights, the terrible, lonely, rejecting nights. Alex would reach for Anita in the darkness, his hand finding her waist, his lips seeking her neck. She'd been his once, and that muscle memory of intimacy remained even as everything else felt foreign and wrong. He craved connection, craved reassurance, craved proof that he'd made the right choice in coming here. "Not tonight, Alex," she'd say, her voice flat and dismissive, cold as winter. "I'm exhausted. I can't deal with this right now. Why are you always so needy?" "And tomorrow then? Maybe tomorrow we'll see. Maybe when you've made more progress helping me. Maybe when there's something to celebrate. Maybe when you've proven you're worth my time and attention. Maybe when you're more like the man I remember and less like whoever this is." She'd turn away from him, her back a wall, her silence a rejection that somehow felt more intimate than any embrace, more devastating than any argument. Cold sheets and colder silence stretching between them like miles, night after night the same script. His reaching, her turning away. The rejection becoming routine, becoming expected, becoming the new normal. He began to wonder if she even wanted him there, if this whole situation was just a mistake, compounded by another mistake, if he'd destroyed his marriage for nothing, for a ghost, for a fantasy that had never been real. But then morning would come, and she'd smile at him over coffee, and she'd mention something about their future together. And he'd convince himself things would get better. Once everything was fixed, once he'd proven himself worthy, once he'd earned his place in her life again, once he'd shown her he was worth loving, that's what she'd promised after all. That's what he was working toward. One evening, Alex found documents spread across the dining room table, the ones from Melissa's envelope, though he didn't know their origin. Financial records he didn't remember sharing. Details of debts he'd hoped to keep private, mistakes he thought were buried, decisions he'd made in desperation and tried to forget. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice tight with fear and anger. Anita looked up from her laptop, her expression innocent, practiced, perfect. "You must have left them out." "I was just reviewing everything, trying to understand the full picture. I didn't leave these out. I've never shown you these. These are private. These are mine. We're partners in this, Alex. What's private between partners?" She closed her laptop with deliberate slowness, each movement calculated. "Unless you're hiding things from me. Are you hiding things? Are you being dishonest? Should I be worried about trusting you?" "No, these are sensitive. These are personal. These are—" "Everything about our situation is sensitive," she interrupted, her voice hardening. "But if we're going to work together, if we're going to build something, I need to know everything. I need complete transparency. I need to see all of you, the good and the bad and the ugly. Or should I assume you're not as committed as you claimed? Should I think you were lying when you said you'd help me?" He backed down, as she knew he would. Of course he did. She'd positioned it as a test of loyalty, and he couldn't fail tests anymore. He'd failed enough. Failed Melissa. Failed himself. He couldn't fail again. "You're right. I'm sorry. I'm just stressed. I'm not thinking clearly." "I know you are." Her hand touched his cheek, gentle but somehow condescending, the way you'd pat a confused child, the way you'd comfort someone simple. "That's why you're making poor decisions. That's why you're being sensitive about things that don't matter. You need to trust me, Alex. I'm trying to help you. We're helping each other. We're in this together." Later, he'd realized she'd somehow made his boundary into his fault, his privacy into his paranoia, his reasonable concern into his failure. But in the moment, tired and confused and desperate to believe he'd made the right choice, he accepted her version of events, accepted her reality as truth. That night, he lay awake listening to sounds from elsewhere in the house. Anita's laughter, light and genuine in a way it never was with him, floating up through the vents. Jamie's deeper voice responding, intimate and familiar. Were they downstairs? Were they working late? Or were they something else, something he didn't want to name, something he couldn't afford to acknowledge? He pushed the thought away with desperate force. He was being paranoid again, being sensitive about things that didn't matter, being jealous and insecure, and everything Anita said was wrong with him, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind drifted to Melissa, to their home, to the life he'd abandoned. She'd never criticized his shirts or his table manners. She'd never compared him unfavorably to other men. She'd never made him feel inadequate or insufficient or constantly failing. When he reached for her in the night, she'd turned toward him, not away. She'd welcomed him instead of rejecting him. She'd made him feel loved instead of tolerated. He picked up his phone, opened his messages to her. No texts since he'd left. Radio silence from both directions. The empty conversation mocked him, white space where connection used to be. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. "I miss you" seemed pathetic. "I made a mistake" seemed too late, too insufficient. "How are you" seemed insulting in its casualness, trivializing what he'd done. He typed nothing. Put the phone down, stared at the ceiling until dawn, counting water stains and regrets in equal measure. Downstairs, Anita and Jamie sat close on the couch, papers forgotten on the coffee table, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "He's breaking faster than I expected," Jamie observed, impressed despite himself. "Good. The faster he breaks, the faster we get what we need, and the faster we can move on to the next phase. You don't feel bad? Not even a little bit?" Anita laughed, cold and clear, the sound of ice cracking.
"For what?"
He left his wife to come here. He made his choices. He walked into this with his eyes open, or at least he should have. I'm just showing him the consequences. I'm just teaching him what happens when you choose ego over love. Still, he really thinks you're going to love him again. He really believes this is real. Men always think their love is enough to change women who never loved them in the first place. She lifted her head, looking at Jamie with genuine affection, the warmth she withheld from Alex, the real emotion she saved for someone worthy. They never learn. They never see what's right in front of them. They see what they want to see. Jamie kissed her forehead with real tenderness. How much longer do we need him? Until he's given us everything we need. Until we've extracted every possible benefit. Then we'll cut him loose and let him crawl back to wherever men like him go when they've destroyed everything. Let him deal with the wreckage of his own making. Upstairs, Alex finally fell asleep, dreaming of Melissa's smile and waking to Anita's cold assessment of everything he did wrong. The poisoned paradise was working exactly as designed, destroying him slowly, methodically, perfectly. Chapter 5. The cruelest awakening. Alex had been in Anita's house long enough that the unfamiliar had become routine, though routine didn't mean comfortable. It meant numb. It meant accepting. It meant he'd stopped fighting against the constant criticism and started believing he deserved it. His reflection in her bathroom mirror showed a man he barely recognized. Thinner, with shadows under his eyes that looked like bruises. A tightness around his mouth that spoke of words swallowed and pain suppressed. He looked haunted. He looked defeated. He looked like someone who'd lost more than he'd gained and was only now beginning to understand the trade he'd made. He'd been working relentlessly on Anita's situation, analyzing every angle, making calls to contacts who might help, meeting with potential helpers that Jamie arranged. The solutions were starting to take shape, he thought. Things might actually be salvageable, he believed. If everyone involved was willing to take certain risks, if everyone was willing to help in the ways Anita needed, Alex was willing. He'd already committed his own resources, redirecting funds from accounts Melissa didn't know about, making guarantees he probably shouldn't make, putting his reputation on the line in ways that would haunt him later. But that was the price of proving himself, wasn't it? That was what love required. That was what Anita needed to see. That morning, she found him at the dining room table, surrounded by papers, coffee gone cold beside him, his eyes red from lack of sleep and too much screen time. Still at it? Her voice held no warmth, no appreciation for his efforts, no recognition of his sacrifice. Almost done. I think I've found a way to handle everything. It'll take some resources from my end and some creative approaches, but creative approaches. She laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. It was mocking, dismissive, cruel. Is that what we're calling it? Creative approaches. That's a nice way of saying desperate measures from someone who doesn't know what he's doing. He looked up, confused by her tone, hurt by her words. I thought that's what you wanted. A solution, help. I've been working on this non-stop. I've barely slept. I've done everything you asked. I want competence, Alex, not whatever this is. She gestured dismissively at his work, waving her hand like she was shooing away something distasteful. Not this pathetic scrambling. Not this inadequate attempt at being useful. I've been doing this for so long. Barely sleeping. Ignoring everything else. Trying to save your situation. Trying to help you. Trying to help yourself, you mean. Trying to prove you're not as useless as I'm starting to think you are. Trying to convince yourself you made the right choice coming here when we both know you didn't. The words hit like a slap, like a punch, like something physical that left marks. He stood, papers sliding to the floor. Too tired and frustrated to remain calm, too hurt to pretend this wasn't destroying him. I've given you everything. My time, my money, my expertise, my reputation. What more do you want from me? I want the man I thought you were, she said, her eyes cold, assessing, finding him lacking in every possible way. But maybe he never existed. Maybe you were always just mediocre, and I was too young to see it. Maybe Melissa settled when she married you, and I'm just repeating her mistake. The mention of Melissa stung worse than anything else. The comparison! The suggestion that he'd never been worthy of either of them. Before he could respond, the front door opened. Jamie walked in, carrying coffee and pastries like he lived there, like this was his home, like Alex was the guest, and Jamie was the resident. His eyes took in the scene, the scattered papers, Alex's defensive posture, Anita's expression of barely concealed contempt, and his smile widened. "Everything okay?" Jamie asked, though his tone suggested he knew it wasn't, that he was enjoying the chaos, that this was all part of some plan. "Fine," Anita said. her voice softening for Jamie in a way it never softened for Alex. Alex was just showing me his latest brilliant plan to save us all. The way she said brilliant when talking about Alex's work made it sound like an insult, like sarcasm, like mockery. But when she'd said it about Jamie before, it had sounded genuine, admiring, warm. Jamie set down the coffee and began reviewing Alex's work without being asked, leaning over the table with proprietary ease, making small humming sounds as he read. "Interesting approach," he said finally, his tone suggesting it was anything but interesting. "Not what I would have done, but interesting. In a desperate, last resort kind of way. What would you have done?" Alex asked, hating how desperate he sounded for validation, for approval, for anything that suggested his efforts weren't completely worthless. Jamie proceeded to explain an alternative approach, his voice confident and casual, laying out in moments what had taken Alex days to develop. And worse, his approach was better, cleaner, more elegant, more intelligent. The kind of solution that made Alex's attempts look clumsy and amateurish by comparison. Anita listened with rapt attention, her body leaning toward Jamie, her expression transforming into something like admiration, like respect, like attraction. "That's brilliant, Jamie, absolutely brilliant. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. That's what real intelligence looks like." The word brilliant sounded completely different when applied to Jamie. It sounded genuine, real, deserved. "It's really just basic thinking," Jamie said with false modesty, with practiced humility. Anyone with real experience could have seen it. Anyone competent would have started there. The implication hung heavy in the air, like smoke. Alex didn't have real experience. Alex wasn't competent. Alex hadn't seen the obvious. Alex wasn't capable. Alex would never be enough. Something cracked in Alex's chest, something that had been bending under pressure for weeks, finally snapping. The rest of that day was a blur. Jamie stayed, working alongside Anita, their heads bent together over laptops, their conversation flowing easily with inside jokes and shared references and the kind of intimacy that comes from real connection. Alex sat on the periphery, nominally part of the team, but clearly superfluous, obviously unwanted, painfully unnecessary. He was in the kitchen getting water when he heard Anita's voice from the home office, low and intimate, vulnerable in a way it never was with him. "God, what would I do without you?" "You'll never have to find out," Jamie's voice replied. Warm and reassuring, promising and protective, Alex moved toward the sound, something pulling him forward despite knowing he shouldn't, despite knowing he wouldn't like what he found, despite every instinct screaming to turn around and walk away. The office door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, he saw them, Jamie's hands on Anita's waist, her fingers tangled in his hair. Their bodies pressed together in a way that spoke of familiarity, of countless other times, exactly like this, of intimacy that went back much further than Alex's arrival. This wasn't sudden passion born of crisis. This was routine. This was love. This was real. They kissed like people who'd been kissing for a very long time, who knew each other's rhythms, who fit together perfectly. Alex must have made a sound, a gasp, a choke, something, because they pulled apart. Anita's eyes met his through the gap in the door. For a moment, no one moved. The world stopped. Time froze. Then she smiled. Actually smiled. Not embarrassed. Not apologetic. Not caught. Just satisfied. Victorious. Like this was all part of the plan. Alex pushed the door open fully, his body moving on autopilot, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing, what it meant, what he'd walked into. "How long? How long have Jamie and I been together?" Anita's voice was casual, conversational, as if discussing the weather or dinner plans. "Since before I contacted you. Since before you left your wife. Since before you convinced yourself I wanted you back. Since always, really. Since you were never really an option." The floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet. The walls closed in. The air became thick and hard to breathe. "You said he was your friend. Your close friend. He is. Among other things. Among many, many other things." She stepped away from Jamie, but casually, without shame or guilt, without any indication that being caught mattered at all. "Did you really think I wanted you, Alex? Did you actually believe I'd choose you over him? That I'd want you back for anything other than what you could do for me? You said, when everything was fixed, you said we'd have a second chance. You said, I said what you needed to hear to keep you motivated. She interrupted, her voice hard now, cold, done with pretending. I said what would make you work harder, sacrifice more, give me everything I needed. Men are so easy that way. Promise them love and suddenly they'll do anything. Promise them sex and they become your slaves. Jamie, to his credit, looked slightly uncomfortable. Anita, maybe we should what? Spare his feelings. She laughed, sharp and cutting. Why? He didn't spare his wife's feelings when he abandoned her to come running to me. He didn't consider her pain when he chose his ego over her love. Why should I spare him anything? Alex felt like he was drowning, like he'd been underwater this whole time and only now realized he couldn't breathe. I left everything for you. I destroyed my marriage for you. You left everything because your ego couldn't resist being needed, Anita said, her voice dropping to something almost gentle, which was somehow more cruel, more devastating. I never loved you, Alex. Not when we were married before, not now, not ever. You were always just a means to an end. A wallet with legs, a solution to problems, a tool to be used and discarded. This, all of this. The problems, the crisis, everything. It was just to use me. Finally, he catches on. She turned to Jamie with mock surprise. See, I told you he'd figure it out eventually. It just took longer than I expected, longer than it should have. Alex's hands clenched at his sides, his whole body trembling with rage and pain and devastation. I gave you everything. You gave me what I needed and nothing I wanted, Anita corrected. You gave me resources I required and labor I didn't want to pay for. And in return, I gave you the chance to feel important, to play hero, to pretend you were the kind of man someone would need desperately enough to take him back, to feed your pathetic ego. But none of it was real. Obviously not. She moved back to Jamie's side, claiming her territory, making it clear where her loyalty lay. Things are stable enough now. Your contributions, while crude and amateurish, accomplished their purpose. You're free to go. Actually, you're required to go. I want you out. And if I don't, if I expose what you've done, if I tell people how you manipulated me. She pulled a familiar envelope from her desk drawer. Melissa's envelope. The insurance policy. Then I used these documents your helpful ex-wife provided. These details about your debts, your questionable decisions, your little secrets that would ruin what's left of your reputation. I wonder how your remaining contacts would feel about this information becoming public. The room spun. The betrayal doubled, layered. Melissa gave you those? She delivered them personally. Well, to my mailbox, but close enough. Anita's smile was vicious, triumphant, cruel. Apparently, she wanted to make sure I had everything I needed to destroy you properly. She armed me. She gave me the weapons. She handed me the tools for your destruction and stepped back to watch. She's a very thorough woman, your ex-wife. I respect that. She's smarter than you ever deserved. Alex couldn't breathe. Melissa had known, had seen through everything, had armed his enemy and let him walk straight into the trap, had orchestrated his destruction and watched from a distance as it unfolded exactly as she'd planned. Why? The word came out broken, barely a whisper. Why would she do that? Why did she help me? I assume because you deserved it, because you earned this destruction, because watching you suffer was payment for what you did to her. Anita shrugged, unconcerned. Why did I do this? Because I could, because you made it easy, because watching prideful men realize they're nothing special is surprisingly satisfying, because destroying you was entertaining. She opened the front door with finality, the gesture unmistakable. Now get out of my house, Alex. Go wherever men like you go when they've burned down their own lives. Just go. Disappear. Stop existing in my space. Alex grabbed his suitcase, the same one Melissa had packed with such care, which somehow made everything worse, and walked out the door in a daze. It slammed behind him with terrible finality, the sound echoing like a judgment, like an ending, like everything he'd built crashing down at once. He stood on the porch, The same porch where Melissa had dropped him off with such eerie calm, such perfect control, such complete understanding of what would happen. The same mailbox where she'd planted the envelope that gave Anita all the weapons she needed. His phone was full of missed calls from people he'd been ignoring, voicemails he hadn't returned, problems he'd let slide while playing hero for a woman who'd never needed saving, who'd just needed using him. He had nowhere to go. No home, no wife, no dignity, no future. Just a suitcase full of clothes and a car he couldn't bear to sit in yet, and the crushing weight of understanding that he'd destroyed everything for nothing. For less than nothing, for active malice disguised as need, behind the closed door. He heard Anita and Jamie laughing. Not cruelly. That would have been better somehow. Would have given him something to hate, something to rage against. Just laughing at something unrelated. At some private joke, at life continuing without him, already having forgotten he existed. He was nothing to them, had always been nothing, would always be nothing, and Melissa had known, had seen it all coming, had helped it happen, had armed his destroyers and stepped back to watch. That realization hurt worse than everything else combined, cut deeper than betrayal, burned worse than humiliation. She'd stopped loving him long before he'd left. She'd just let him destroy himself to prove it. Chapter 6. The Ghost and the Gossip. Alex sat in his car for hours after Anita threw him out, parked several blocks away, where he wouldn't have to see her house. The leather seats that once felt luxurious now felt like a cage. The tinted windows that once provided privacy now just reflected his own pathetic face back at him. His phone kept buzzing with notifications he couldn't bring himself to check. Each vibration a reminder of consequences accumulating. When darkness finally fell, muscle memory took over. He started driving with no conscious destination, but his hands knew where to go. They turned onto familiar streets until he found himself sitting outside the house he used to own, the house where Melissa still lived. Lights glowed warm in the windows. Through the sheer curtains, he could see movement, her shadow passing from room to room, living her life, continuing to exist in a world that no longer included him. He wanted to knock on the door, wanted to confess everything, to tell her she'd been right, to beg for forgiveness he didn't deserve, but shame kept him frozen. How could he face her after everything? After choosing Anita? After being so spectacularly wrong? While he watched, another car pulled into the driveway. Alex's stomach clenched. A man got out, tall, well-dressed, confident. The man carried takeout food, walked to the front door like he belonged there. When Melissa opened the door, she smiled. Actually smiled. The real one, the genuine one, the one that lit up her whole face. The man handed her the food, said something that made her laugh, actually laugh, her head thrown back, joy evident, and then left. But the easy familiarity, the comfortable affection, the way she'd smiled at him, it all spoke of something Alex couldn't afford to acknowledge. Someone better. Someone who appreciated her. Alex waited until the man's car disappeared, then sat there longer, watching Melissa move through the house, living a life that had closed around the space he used to occupy like water filling a hole. She didn't look heartbroken. Didn't look like she was suffering or pining for him. She looked free, happy, better off. He drove away, before she could notice his car lurking like some pathetic spectre. The following days were a nightmare of embarrassment and social disaster. Everyone knew. Everyone had heard. Alex Hopkins left his devoted wife for his ex, thinking she wanted him back, only to discover she was using him. He'd been played, humiliated, made a fool of. At a restaurant, Alex overheard two men talking at the bar. "That's him," one said, not bothering to lower his voice. "That's Alex Hopkins, the guy who got played by his ex-wife." "Yeah. Left his wife for her, gave her everything, and she was just using him before kicking him out. Textbook manipulation. What an idiot. What kind of moron leaves someone good for someone who already betrayed him once?" Poor bastard thought she loved him. She just needed a fool, and he volunteered. They laughed, those casual, cruel laughs that come easy when discussing someone else's pain. Alex left without eating. Couldn't face sitting through a meal while being the punchline of everyone's jokes. Friends stopped responding to texts. Colleagues made excuses about being busy. Invitations dried up completely. He'd become toxic, the cautionary tale people referenced when warning their own partners. Don't pull an Alex Hopkins became shorthand for making catastrophically stupid relationship decisions. He heard it at the gym. Man, don't even think about texting your ex. Don't pull an Alex Hopkins. He heard it at the coffee shop. You better treat her right or you'll end up like that Alex Hopkins guy. Alone and pathetic, his name had become synonymous with foolishness. One evening, desperate for human connection, Alex went to a bar he used to frequent. The bartender recognized him, but there was something different in his expression. Pity maybe, or judgment. A woman sat down beside him. "You're Alex Hopkins," she said. Not a question. A judgment, yeah. The guy who left Melissa Swift for his ex. His jaw tightened. News travels fast. Small world, she sipped her drink, studying him. "I know Melissa. We're in the same yoga class. She's doing really well, in case you were wondering. Better than she's been in years. She's been glowing lately," the woman continued. "Started taking pottery classes. Joined a book club. She said something about finally having time for herself again. She seems lighter, happier, free." The implication was clear. Time she'd spent taking care of Alex was now free for her own joy. She was better off without him. Good for her, Alex managed. She deserves to be happy. Yeah, it is good for her. The woman stood, leaving money for her drink. "You know what the funny thing is? Everyone always knew Melissa was too good for you. We just hoped you'd realize it before you did something stupid. Guess you proved us all right." She walked away, leaving Alex alone with the crushing knowledge that everyone had seen it. Everyone had known. Too good for him. Everyone had known. Everyone except him. That night, sleeping in his car in a parking garage, Alex finally let himself admit the truth. He'd destroyed the best thing in his life for an illusion, for ego, for the feeling of being needed instead of being loved. He'd traded authentic love for manipulative need. He'd chosen ego over substance, and everyone could see it except him. His phone buzzed. Another notification he couldn't face. He didn't open it. His world was collapsing, his reputation in shambles, his relationship severed in the darkness of his car, surrounded by the quiet sounds of other engines leaving, going home to families and lives that made sense. Alex finally understood what Melissa had known all along. He'd been nothing without her. She'd been his foundation, his support, his strength, and now he was nothing without her in an entirely different way. Now he was just nothing, empty, hollow, a cautionary tale, a punchline, a ghost of who he used to be. Chapter 7. The empire crumbles. Morning came harsh and unforgiving, sunlight streaming through the car windows like an accusation, like judgment, like exposure. Alex's neck ached from sleeping at an awkward angle against the steering wheel. His mouth tasted like regret and stale coffee and failure. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the man staring back, unshaven, hollow-eyed, wearing yesterday's wrinkled shirt, looking like he'd aged a decade in a handful of weeks. His phone screen showed dozens of missed calls and twice as many messages. He scrolled through them with detached horror, watching his life disintegrate in real time, watching everything he'd built crumble while he'd been busy destroying himself. People he'd thought were friends had sent cold. Formal messages distancing themselves, protecting their own reputations. Acquaintances he'd networked with for connections had politely withdrawn their offers of collaboration, making excuses, closing doors. Even family members had reached out with disappointment rather than support, with judgment rather than compassion, with "I told you so" rather than comfort. His mother's voicemail was particularly cutting. "I don't even know what to say to you. Alex, Melissa was the best thing that ever happened to you, and you threw her away for that woman who hurt you before. I'm ashamed. Your father would be ashamed. Don't call me until you've figured out how to fix what you've broken. Don't come home until you're ready to be the man you should have been all along." He didn't call back. Couldn't bear to hear more disappointment in her voice, more shame, more confirmation that he'd failed. His sister had texted, and somehow her message hurt worse. "Melissa called me. She's heartbroken, but handling it with more grace than you deserve. More grace than I could manage. What were you thinking? Actually, don't answer. I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't want to hear you try to justify what you did. There is no justification. You chose this. You did this. This is who you are." Even his sister had chosen Melissa's side. Not that there were sides, there was just right and wrong. And Alex had been catastrophically, irredeemably wrong. He tried calling former colleagues, people he'd helped before, people who owed him favors, people who'd promised they'd always be there. Most didn't answer, his calls going straight to voicemail, the silence speaking volumes. The few who did answer were carefully neutral, their voices cold. "Alex, I don't think we should work together right now. Let's reconnect later." Much later. Maybe never. Later. That polite word that meant never. That gentle phrase that meant lose my number. Everyone was distancing themselves, protecting themselves, cutting ties before his failure contaminated them. The powerful man he used to be was gone. In his place was someone nobody wanted to know, someone people actively avoided, someone whose name had become a warning. Alex tried to eat, but couldn't keep anything down. His stomach rejecting food like his life had rejected him. He'd lost weight, his body consuming itself, eating away at what remained. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had been solid but now felt fragile. His face in every reflection looked gaunt, haunted, like a ghost of himself. He drove aimlessly, burning gas he probably couldn't afford much longer. Watching the city pass by like scenes from someone else's life, like a movie he was watching rather than living. Normal people going to normal places, having normal problems, living in a world where everything made sense, where cause and effect were predictable, where choices had consequences they could foresee. His phone rang. An unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but anything was better than silence, better than being alone with his thoughts. "Alex Hopkins." "Yes. This is calling from your insurance company. We need to discuss your recent claims and some discrepancies we've found in your applications. It appears there may have been some inaccurate information provided, and we need to—" Alex hung up. Financial disaster on top of social disaster. Everything compounding, snowballing, accelerating toward complete destruction. He parked in a grocery store lot, watching people come and go with their carts and their families and their simple afternoon plans, with their problems that had solutions, with their lives that made sense. A couple argued near a minivan. She was upset about something. He was defensive, their body language screaming conflict. But then she said something soft, and he softened too, his posture changing, his defense crumbling. They reached for each other. They loaded groceries together. They drove away together, having worked through whatever stupid thing they'd been fighting about because they understood something Alex had forgotten. They understood that relationships worth having required effort, grace, forgiveness, work, communication, choosing each other even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, like he and Melissa used to do. Before he'd forgotten how to be that kind of partner, before he'd stopped trying, before he'd taken her for granted. A family walked past with a small girl on her father's shoulders, laughing at something the mother said, their joy uncomplicated and pure. The father looked at his wife with such obvious love, such contentment, such gratitude, and Alex felt something crack inside him. Something that had been holding together finally shattering, that could have been his future. Children with Melissa, growing old together, simple joys compounding into a life worth living, ordinary moments that added up to extraordinary happiness, building something real instead of destroying something precious. He'd traded all of it for what? For Anita's cold rejection? For Jamie's smug superiority? For being used and discarded like trash? For ego and fantasy and illusion? For feeling needed instead of being loved, for temporary validation instead of permanent partnership. His phone buzzed. A text from someone he didn't know. "Saw you at the grocery store. You look rough, really rough. Hope things get better." Probably won't, but hope anyway. Someone was watching him. Someone knew he was falling apart. Someone was probably texting others right now. Just saw Alex Hopkins at the store. Looks terrible. Serves him right. The humiliation was complete, total, inescapable. He drove to a different parking lot. This one behind an abandoned strip mall, where no one would see him, where no one would witness his breakdown, where he could disappear, where no one would text him about how pathetic he looked, about how far he'd fallen, about how much he deserved this. His phone rang again. He didn't recognize the number but answered anyway, desperate for any human contact, any connection to the world. "Alex, this is calling about your accounts. We need to discuss some irregularities and outstanding balances. The guarantees you made have become problematic, and we need immediate payment or we'll be forced to—" He hung up. More problems, more consequences, more bills coming due, more debts he couldn't pay, more evidence that he'd destroyed everything. He scrolled through his contacts list, looking for anyone who might still talk to him. Anyone who hadn't written him off completely. Anyone who might offer a shred of compassion or understanding. The list was depressingly short. Names crossed out in his mind one by one, each rejection remembered, each cold shoulder catalogued. He tried calling his best friend from college, the person who'd been at his wedding, who'd promised to always be there. The call went to voicemail, the greeting impersonal and distant. "Hey man, this is Alex. I know things are complicated right now, but I could really use someone to talk to. I'm falling apart here. Please call me back." No call came. Hours passed, no call. Just silence, just abandonment. He tried another friend, another voicemail, another message left that would probably never be returned, another plea for help that would go unanswered. Everyone had abandoned him. Or more accurately, he'd driven everyone away with his choices, with his selfishness, with his spectacular failure, and now he was reaping what he'd sown, harvesting consequences he'd planted himself. As darkness fell again, Alex's thoughts turned to Melissa in that endless loop he couldn't escape, that obsessive circle his mind couldn't break free from. Was she home now? Was someone with her? Had she moved on already? Found someone who appreciated what Alex had taken for granted? Someone better? Someone worthy? He drove past their house again, unable to help himself, drawn like a moth to flame, like a ghost to haunting. The lights were on, warm and golden and inviting. Her car was in the driveway. No other cars this time. Just her, living her life, existing without him, continuing to breathe and move and be while his world crumbled. The urge to knock on the door was overwhelming, nearly irresistible, a physical pull, to fall at her feet, to beg forgiveness he didn't deserve, to confess everything, to admit she'd been right about everything, to grovel and plead and promise to be better if she'd just give him one more chance. But what right did he have? What claim could he make? What could he possibly say that would make any difference? "I'm sorry" was too small, too inadequate for the destruction he'd caused. "I was wrong" was too obvious, too insufficient. "I love you" was true but meaningless after what he'd done. Hollow words after devastating action. So he sat in his car, watching her shadow move past windows. A ghost, haunting the life he'd abandoned, a spectre of his own making. Watching the woman who'd loved him live better without him. His phone battery was dying, the percentage dropping, his last connection to the world fading. Soon he'd be truly alone, cut off from even the possibility of connection, isolated completely. He was hungry, exhausted, defeated, destroyed. But more than anything, he was lonely. Not alone. He'd been alone before, had enjoyed solitude, had valued independence. This was different. This was the bone-deep understanding that he'd severed every meaningful connection in his life, that he'd burned every bridge, that he'd chosen isolation and was now stuck with its consequences, that he'd made his bed and now had to lie in it. Tomorrow he'd have to figure out where to sleep. Tomorrow he'd have to face more consequences. Tomorrow he'd have to start rebuilding something from the ashes of everything he'd destroyed. Tomorrow he'd have to begin the impossible task of living with what he'd done. But tonight he sat in darkness behind an abandoned building, staring at a dying phone, wondering how a man could lose everything so quickly, So thoroughly, so completely. The answer he knew was simple: by taking everything for granted, by valuing what he didn't have over what he did, by choosing ego over love, by being exactly the kind of fool everyone had tried to warn him not to be, by being Alex Hopkins. Chapter 8. The hunger for redemption. Alex moved from cheap hotel to cheaper hotel, rooms that smelled like industrial cleaner and loneliness. He wasn't eating properly, couldn't stomach more than a few bites before nausea overwhelmed him. His body was rejecting food the way the rest of his life had rejected him, completely, thoroughly, without negotiation. His reflection was startling now. The weight loss was obvious. His cheeks had hollowed. His clothes hung on him like they belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't shrunk into this pathetic version of himself. But his body's weakness was nothing compared to his heart's. That was the real starvation, not for food, but for connection, for meaning, for the love he'd thrown away like garbage. He spent hours in parking lots, watching people, families, couples, friends meeting for coffee, a father pushing a stroller while his wife carried bags. The way they moved without coordination, but with perfect synchronization, practiced teamwork born of actual partnership. Two elderly people holding hands as they walked slowly through a park. Their bodies leaned slightly toward each other, pulled by decades of gravity and devotion. A young couple arguing outside a restaurant. She was angry. He was defensive. But then he stopped, said something that made her laugh despite herself, and the tension broke. They went inside together, working through it, not running from it. Every scene was a knife. Every moment of connection reminded him of what he'd destroyed. He thought about Melissa constantly, not the way he'd thought about her when he first left, that had been guilty, defensive, rationalized. This was different. This was deep and aching and honest. He remembered the way she'd curl up beside him on the couch, the watching being just an excuse to be close, the way she'd listen when he talked about his day, really listen, asking follow-up questions that proved she'd been paying attention, the way she'd fix his coffee without asking because she knew exactly how he liked it, knew him better than he knew himself, the fierce intelligence she'd shown when quietly steering him away from bad decisions. He'd thought he was brilliant in those moments. She'd been the brilliance, and he'd just been the fool taking credit, her laugh. Full and genuine and generous, given freely to his terrible jokes, making him feel funnier and smarter and better than he was. Her loyalty that never wavered, even when he didn't deserve it. She'd stood beside him, believing in him, propping him up with quiet strength he'd never acknowledged. He'd thrown away devotion for performance, authenticity for manipulation, love for the illusion of being needed. The breaking point came in a grocery store parking lot where he'd been sitting for hours, watching people with their mundane shopping trips and normal problems. A couple emerged, arguing. The man said something sharp. The woman's face fell, hurt evident even from a distance. Alex prepared to watch another relationship splinter, but then the woman stopped walking, said something quiet. The man's expression changed, softened, opened, became human again. He reached for her hand. She took it. They loaded their groceries together and drove away together, having worked through whatever they'd been fighting about, because they understood something Alex had forgotten. Relationships worth having required effort, grace, forgiveness, work, and watching them disappear. Something inside Alex finally broke completely, not with tears. Those had come already. This was different. This was a terrible, clarifying admission. He'd destroyed the only woman who'd ever truly loved him. He'd taken loyalty and repaid it with betrayal. He'd taken love and repaid it with abandonment. He'd taken everything Melissa offered and thrown it back in her face because his ego needed feeding more than his heart needed keeping. And now he was here, alone, broken, empty. His hand shook on the steering wheel as he started the car. He knew what he had to do. He had to go back, had to face Melissa, had to throw himself at her mercy and beg for a forgiveness he didn't deserve. She'd probably slam the door in his face. She'd be right to. She'd be justified in every cruel thing she might say, but he had to try, not because he deserved another chance. He didn't, but because living in this purgatory of consequences was impossible. He was dying here, slowly, painfully. The drive toward their house felt like swimming through concrete. Every mile was heavier than the last. His heart pounded in his throat. His hands were slick with sweat. He rehearsed what he'd say, but every phrase felt inadequate. "I'm sorry" sounded like a joke. "I was wrong" was laughably insufficient. "I love you" was true, but meaningless after everything he'd done. He pulled over at a rest stop, his hands shaking too badly to drive. Other travelers moved around him. A man helped his elderly mother. A group of friends laughed. A woman talked on the phone, smiling. Normal people, living, connecting, loving, everything Alex had once had and thrown away. What if Melissa had moved on? What if there was someone new, someone who appreciated her from the beginning? Someone better? He'd seen that man delivering food to her house. What if they were together? The thought was agony. But he deserved that agony. He got back on the road. The sun was setting, painting the sky in golds and purples that Melissa would have stopped to photograph. She always noticed beauty. He'd always been too busy to look. He passed their favorite restaurant, past the park where they'd walked, past the coffee shop where she'd gotten that complicated drink he'd never memorized. Every landmark was a memory. Every memory was a wound. Night fell. His headlights cut through darkness. He was close now. His chest felt tight, his breathing shallow. Fear coursed through him, but beneath the fear was something else. Not hope. He didn't deserve hope. But maybe the distant possibility of peace. The chance to finally tell the truth. Even if she destroyed him, at least it would be honest. He turned onto their street. The houses were mostly dark, and there, their house, the windows glowing golden. She was home. His foot eased off the gas. The car crawled those final feet. He parked, turned off the engine, sat there in darkness, staring at the house where he used to live. His hand reached for the door handle, pulled back, reached again. He'd faced hostile people, impossible situations, rooms full of those who wanted him to fail. None of that had terrified him like this moment. But he'd come this far. He'd lost everything. Alex opened the door, got out. Each step toward the house felt like walking to an execution, but he kept walking. The front steps, the porch, the door he'd walked through 1,000 times. His hand raised to knock, shaking, and from inside he heard movement. Melissa was coming to the door. Whatever happened next, he'd earned it, all of it. Chapter 9. The road of reckoning. Alex stood frozen on the porch, his hand still raised to knock when the door opened. Melissa stood there, backlit by the warm glow of their home. She wasn't surprised to see him. Her expression suggested she'd known he was coming, had let him work up courage before allowing him to complete his journey. She looked different. Her hair was cut shorter, framing her face in a way that made her features stronger. She wore comfortable clothes, no makeup, no performance. She looked like herself in a way she hadn't in years, like she'd stopped trying to be what someone else needed and had remembered who she actually was. "Melissa," he said, his voice cracking. She didn't respond, just stood there, looking at him with eyes that held no anger, no pain, no hatred, just assessment, like she was examining something mildly interesting, but ultimately inconsequential. That look hurt worse than rage would have. "Can I—" Alex's legs gave out. The shame, the exhaustion, the weight of everything finally broke him. He collapsed to his knees right there on her porch. Tears came. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. "God, Melissa, I'm so sorry. I destroyed everything. I was so stupid, so blind, so selfish." Alex, his name in her voice, stopped him. He looked up through tears. She still hadn't moved. Hadn't reached down to help him, just stood there like a queen, looking down at a beggar, unmoved by his display. "Please," he whispered. "Please, I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I'm begging you to listen. To give me any chance at all to what?" Her voice was calm, measured. "To earn your way back into my life? To make me believe you've changed? To convince me that abandoning me was some temporary insanity?" "Yes, any of that. All of that. He was sobbing now. I love you. I never stopped loving you. I was just so stupid, so caught up in feeling needed, in playing hero, in feeding your ego, she finished. Yes, I know. The silence stretched. Alex remained on his knees, while Melissa stood unmoved above him. Finally, she spoke. You chased betrayal thinking it was love. You chose lies over loyalty. You threw away devotion for manipulation and came back here empty-handed with nothing but regrets. Each word landed like a stone. Alex couldn't argue. I am not the woman you left behind, Melissa continued, her voice carrying the weight of iron. I don't need you, Alex. I don't need your promises or your apologies. I built a life without you. I found my strength while you were discovering your weakness. I know, he whispered. I know I don't deserve you. But please, Melissa, please just let me try. Let me prove that I can be better. You don't even know what that means. She tilted her head slightly. The man I deserved would never have left in the first place. The man I deserved would have valued what he had. The man I deserved would have understood that love isn't about being needed. It's about choosing someone every day. I understand that now, Alex said desperately. Losing you taught me that. Being used taught me that. Being alone taught me that. I finally understand everything I took for granted. Do you? She crossed her arms. Or do you just understand that consequences hurt? That being used feels terrible? That loneliness is uncomfortable? Understanding what you lost isn't the same as understanding why you lost it. He opened his mouth and closed it again. He didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound hollow. You left because you needed to feel important, Melissa said, each word precise. You needed Anita to need you more than I loved you. Your ego required feeding more than your marriage required protecting. And now you're back because being humiliated hurts, because being alone is hard, because rebuilding from nothing is scary. That's not... But he stopped. Because it was partly true. I'm not saying you don't regret what you did, Melissa continued. I believe you do. But regret isn't the same as change, Alex. Regret is just pain at consequences. Change is becoming someone new. Then let me change, he begged. Give me the chance to prove I can be different. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet. But maybe the distant possibility of it, if... She paused, choosing her words carefully. If you want any part of my life again, it will be on my terms. Not yours. Never yours again. His heart leapt. She hadn't said no. Had offered a tiny sliver of possibility. Anything, he said frantically. Whatever you need. Whatever it takes. I'll do anything. I don't need anything from you. The correction was sharp. That's the point. I'm complete without you. I'm whole without you. I'm happy without you. The words hurt. But they were true. And he could see it in the way she stood, in the calm of her expression. She'd meant it when she said she'd built a life without him. Then why are you even listening to me? He asked. Because I'm curious to see if you're capable of becoming worth the effort. She stepped back slightly. Because the man I married had potential buried under all that ego. And I'm wondering if losing everything might have finally excavated it. She paused. You will earn every single moment of my time. You will prove every single word you speak. You will rebuild what you destroyed, piece by piece, with no promises and no guarantees. Do you understand? He nodded frantically, still on his knees. Yes, I understand. I don't think you do. She leaned against the doorframe. But you're about to. Get up. He stood on shaking legs. Come inside, she said. She led him not to their bedroom, but to the small guest room down the hall. It held only a bed, a nightstand, and a lamp. You'll sleep here, she said. You'll earn your way back to our bed, just like you'll earn your way back to my trust. Maybe you will. Maybe you won't. But either way, it happens on my timeline, not yours. Okay, he whispered. Whatever you say. She turned to leave, then paused. And Alex? That envelope I left in Anita's mailbox? I have copies. I know every mistake you've made, every secret you've kept, not just to use against you, but to remind you that I see everything now. I'll never be blind again. She left him alone in the small room. Alex stood there processing. He'd expected anger, expected punishment, expected to be turned away. Instead, he'd been given something more terrifying, a conditional second chance. Permission to try, with no guarantee of success. He collapsed onto the bed, and for the first time felt something like hope. Not arrogant confidence, but genuine, humble, terrified hope that maybe, just maybe, if he worked harder than he'd ever worked, if he became better than he'd ever been, maybe Melissa would let him back into the life he'd abandoned, or maybe she wouldn't, and he'd have to live with that too. Either way, he was here. Closer to her than he'd been in forever. Tomorrow, he'd have to figure out how to earn his way back. But tonight, he fell asleep grateful for this small mercy, this tiny foothold, and down the hall, Melissa sat in her room and allowed herself a small smile. She'd known he'd come back. Known he'd be broken. Known he'd beg. What she didn't know yet was whether breaking had actually changed him, or if he was just another man who mistook consequences for lessons. Time would tell. And she had all the time in the world, after all. She'd learned something important. She didn't need him to complete her, which meant she could choose him, if he proved worth choosing or not. And either way, she'd be fine. That was the power he'd given her by leaving, the knowledge that she could survive without him. Now he'd have to prove he deserved to be chosen anyway. Chapter 10. The Queen's Judgmental woke. In the unfamiliar guest room, to sunlight streaming through windows that faced the wrong direction. For a disoriented moment, he forgot where he was, expected to be in his car or a cheap hotel. Then reality settled over him like a weight. He was back in his house, but not back in his life. Not yet. Maybe never. He could hear Melissa moving through her morning routine, sounds he'd once taken for granted, now precious. The coffee maker grinding beans, her footsteps crossing the kitchen floor, water running, life continuing. All the sounds of existence, of normalcy, of a life that had learned to function without him. When he finally worked up the courage to leave the guest room, he found Melissa in the kitchen, dressed for the day, drinking coffee and reading. She looked up when he entered, her expression neutral, giving nothing away. "There's coffee," she said, nodding toward the pot. "Help yourself." The casual domesticity of it felt surreal, like a dream, like something borrowed from another life. He poured coffee with shaking hands, the simple task requiring concentration, and sat at the kitchen table where they'd shared thousands of meals together. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for letting me stay last night, for not slamming the door in my face, for listening. I haven't decided if you're staying beyond last night." She set down her tablet. "We need to establish some things. Ground rules, boundaries, expectations. Okay. First, you don't live here. You're a guest, and that status is probationary, temporary, conditional. If I tell you to leave, you leave immediately. No arguments, no negotiations, no begging for more chances." He nodded, his throat tight. "I understand. Second, my life is my own. My schedule, my friends, my activities. None of that concerns you unless I choose to share it. You don't get to ask where I'm going, or who I'm seeing, or what I'm doing. You lost that right when you walked out." The words stung, but he couldn't argue. "Okay, I understand. Third, you're going to fix your life. Your reputation is in shambles. Your relationships are severed. Your future is uncertain. You're going to rebuild all of that, and you're going to do it yourself. I'm not going to save you, Alex. I'm not going to fix your problems or smooth over your mistakes. If you want back into my life, you have to prove you can handle your own first. I will. I'll fix everything. Whatever it takes. Maybe you will." She studied him over her coffee cup. "Or maybe you'll discover you can't, and that will be its own lesson." Over the following days, Alex began the slow, humiliating process of rebuilding. He reached out to people he'd wronged, not to ask for favors, but to apologize, to own his mistakes, to take responsibility without making excuses or asking for forgiveness. Most didn't answer. A few did, listened to his apology with varying degrees of coldness, and wished him well in tones that suggested they'd already forgotten he existed. He found small work where he could. Nothing glamorous, just enough to cover basic expenses if he was very careful. He started therapy not because Melissa asked, but because he needed to understand how he'd become the kind of person who could destroy his own happiness so completely. Through all of this, Melissa watched from a distance. She didn't help, didn't offer advice, didn't smooth his path. She let him struggle, let him fail, let him figure things out on his own. Some evenings they'd have dinner together. Melissa would cook, and they'd sit at the table in careful civility, making small talk that avoided anything substantial. Other evenings, she'd tell him she had plans and he'd eat alone in the guest room, listening to her get ready and leave, wondering where she was going and forcing himself not to ask because he'd lost that right. One evening, Melissa came home and found Alex in the kitchen making dinner, not waiting for her to cook, not demanding to be fed, just quietly preparing a meal. She paused in the doorway. "You're cooking." "Trying to." "It's not as good as yours, but it's edible." She moved into the kitchen, examining his work. "You never cooked when we were married." "I should have." He turned to face her. "You did everything. You ran the household, managed my life, held everything together while I took credit. I never appreciated how much you carried, how much work you did, how much you sacrificed. No, you didn't. I'm sorry for that. For all of it, for every moment I took you for granted." She leaned against the counter. "Are you apologizing because you mean it, or because you think it's what I want to hear?" "Both," he admitted honestly. "I mean it, but I also want you to hear it. Want you to know that I finally understand what I did, what I threw away, who I hurt, how much I lost." Something in her expression softened slightly. "Set the table." They cooked together, moving around each other with cautious coordination. Not the easy teamwork they'd once had, but something new being built on the ruins of something old. After dinner, as they cleaned up, Melissa spoke quietly. "I've been watching you." Alex's heart raced. "And?" "You're trying." "I'll give you that. You're working on your life, facing consequences, not running." She dried a plate slowly. "But I still don't know if you've actually changed, or if you're just better at performing change." "How do I prove the difference?" "Time," she said simply. "Consistency. Being this person not just when I'm watching, but always. I am different." He turned to face her fully. "Losing you showed me what matters. Being used by Anita taught me the difference between love and manipulation. Being alone forced me to see who I am without someone propping me up." Pretty words. True words. She set down the dish towel and looked at him directly. "Do you know what you did to me, Alex? Really understand it? I hurt you. I abandoned you. You made me question my worth," she interrupted. "You made me wonder if years of loyalty meant nothing. You broke something in me that I had to rebuild on my own. And I did rebuild it. I found my strength, my worth, my sense of self that didn't depend on being someone's wife." Her voice remained calm, but he could hear the pain underneath. "And that's why I don't need you anymore, Alex. I did the hard work of healing. I'm complete without you." "I know," he whispered. "I see that. You're stronger now. You're incredible. So if you want back into my life, it's not because I need you. It's because I might choose you. If you prove you're worth choosing." She moved closer. "That envelope I gave Anita. I meant what I said. I have copies. I know everything now. I see you completely, and I'll never be blind again. You broke my trust completely. If it ever comes back, and that's a big if, it will never be what it was." "I understand." "Do you? Because this isn't romantic. This isn't me taking you back with open arms. This is me being willing to watch you try to earn something you destroyed." She turned back to the dishes. "You'll sleep in the guest room tonight. And tomorrow night. Maybe forever. You'll earn your way back slowly, painfully, honestly, with no shortcuts and no guarantees. However long it takes," he said. "I'll wait. I'll work. I'll prove myself. Maybe." She moved toward the doorway, then paused, looking back at him with eyes that had seen him at his worst and his best. "We'll see." Then she was gone, heading to her bedroom, leaving him with hope and the terrible weight of knowing he'd have to earn every moment of what came next. Alex finished cleaning, returned to the guest room, and lay in the small bed. He could hear Melissa in her room, living her life parallel to his, but separate from it. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't a happy ending. It was just a beginning, a chance, a maybe. And for the first time since he'd left, Alex understood that maybe was more than he deserved. He fell asleep not in comfort, but in purpose. Tomorrow he'd keep rebuilding, keep trying, keep proving that the man Melissa had loved still existed somewhere under the fool he'd become. Whether it would be enough, only time would tell.